You've probably met someone like this. They walk into a room and don't immediately look around to see who noticed. They say what they think without that half-second pause where they're checking whether it's okay to say it. They disagree with people, calmly, without apology, and somehow it doesn't feel aggressive. It just feels settled. And if you've ever stood next to someone like that, there's this quiet, strange feeling that follows. Not quite envy, not quite admiration, something more like, how do they do that so easily? Because it doesn't look like they're trying. That's the part that gets you. Most people assume confidence is something you build, something you practice until it becomes second nature. But some people seem to have skipped that whole process entirely, like they arrived already assembled. And that's worth looking at closely, because the reason isn't what most people assume. Here's what's actually going on. Confidence, at its root, isn't a personality trait. It's not something you're born with, like eye color or height. What looks like natural confidence is almost always the result of a very specific kind of early experience, one that most people never examine because it happened so quietly they didn't notice it shaping them. When someone grows up in an environment where their feelings were treated as valid, where saying, "I don't want to do that," wasn't immediately corrected, where their preferences were acknowledged even when they weren't accommodated, something very specific gets wired in. They learn at a foundational level that their inner world is real, that it counts, that it doesn't need to be justified before it's allowed to exist. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. Because what most people carry, without realizing it, is the opposite of that. A quiet, background belief that their feelings are a little too much, that their needs are slightly inconvenient, that before they speak, they need to make sure it's welcome. And that instinct, that checking, is exactly what confidence doesn't do. Watch someone who doesn't feel naturally confident, and you'll start to see it in the smallest places. They soften statements that don't need to be softened. I might be wrong, but before sharing something they're completely right about. They laugh a little too quickly at their own ideas before anyone else can react. They hold eye contact for just a moment too short, not from shyness, but from something older, something learned. These aren't flaws, they're adjustments. Calibrations that were made, usually early, in response to an environment that gave certain signals about how much space they were allowed to take up. And the quietly confident person, they never had to make those adjustments, or the adjustments they made were different ones. They learned to regulate themselves from the inside, rather than reading the room for permission. That's the difference. Not personality, not willpower, permission. One person moves through the world asking, somewhere underneath everything, "Is this okay?" And the other person never developed the habit of asking.
And here's where it gets interesting, because we tend to look at confident people and think the defining thing about them is what they have, some internal resource, strength, certainty, courage, that the rest of us are missing. But that's not quite right. The defining thing about naturally confident people is often what they don't have. They don't carry a constant background scan running, checking for social threat. They don't have that layer of filtering between thought and expression. They don't experience the quiet tax that comes with needing approval before moving. It's not that they feel more, it's that they worry less about what their feelings mean about them. And that's a crucial distinction, because confidence was never really about strength, it was about safety, internal safety, the kind that gets built, or doesn't, long before a person is old enough to understand what's happening to them. The person who seems naturally confident usually isn't braver than you. They were just made to feel, in those early formative years, that being themselves was not a risky thing. Here's how it compounds over time. When you move through the world with that internal safety, people respond to you differently. You take up space, so others make space for you. You speak with some ease, so people listen more readily. You make decisions without excessive second-guessing, so outcomes tend to be cleaner. And every one of those experiences feeds back into the same belief. I'm someone whose presence is okay here. That loop reinforces itself constantly. Each small confirmation adds another quiet layer to the foundation. Now, consider the opposite loop. When someone is always calibrating, always checking, they tend to hold back. And holding back changes how others respond. The slight hesitation, the softened statement, the deferred opinion, these create a different set of experiences that confirm a different kind of self-concept. Neither person chose their loop. Both people are simply living inside the logic of what they were taught to believe about themselves. That's not weakness on one side and strength on the other. It's just conditioning, running exactly as it was designed to. So when you see someone who carries themselves with that quiet ease, who doesn't seem to need the room's approval before they enter it, you're not looking at a different category of human. You're looking at someone whose earliest experiences told them, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that their inner world was safe to trust, that their presence was something the room could handle, that they didn't need to earn the right to take up space. They didn't decide to be confident. They were simply never convinced that being themselves was something to apologize for. And once you understand that, once you see that what looks like natural confidence is almost always a story about early permission and the loops that followed, it starts to look a little less like a personality trait and a little more like a pattern that had a beginning, which means it was never really about who they are. It was about what they were taught to believe about themselves. And that awareness alone changes how you see the whole thing. If this explains something for you about yourself or someone around you, there's always more underneath. Understanding the pattern is where it all starts.